Imagine a land forgotten by hope. A place on the edge of the world, where the sun seems to shine a little dimmer and the shadows stretch a little longer. This was the country of the Gadarenes, a rugged and wild region on the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee. It was a land of steep hills and deep valleys, a place where civilization felt distant, and the wilderness held sway. The local people lived their lives under a constant, unspoken cloud of fear. They whispered stories of things that lurked in the dark and of ancient powers that held dominion over the desolate places just beyond their town. The air itself seemed heavy with a sense of unease. Travelers would often choose longer, more arduous routes just to avoid passing through this territory. They spoke of strange noises carried on the wind at night and of a feeling of being watched from the rocky hillsides. The Gadarenes was a place of tombs and ancient burial caves carved into the limestone cliffs. These were not peaceful resting places for the dead. Instead, they had become dens for something far more terrifying than ghosts. It was a no-man's land, a frontier between the known and the profoundly unknown, a place where people felt very, very small. Here, the normal rhythms of life were disrupted. Shepherds hurried their flocks past the tombs, their eyes darting nervously towards the dark openings in the rock. Fishermen on the nearby sea would cast their nets closer to the opposite shore, avoiding the eerie coastline of the Gadarenes. The local townspeople bolted their doors securely at night, not just against thieves, but against the chilling screams that echoed from the burial grounds. This was not just a physical place, it was a psychological one. It was a landscape that mirrored the despair that had taken root there, a constant and grim reminder of the darkness that could touch the world. This land was a symbol of isolation. It was cut off not just by geography but by a palpable sense of dread. It was a place where light struggled to penetrate both literally and metaphorically. The people had resigned themselves to this reality, accepting that a corner of their world had been surrendered to an unseen malevolent force. They had learned to live around the darkness to coexist with the fear, but they never imagined that anything could ever change. They never dared to hope that a power greater than the one they feared could possibly exist, let alone be on its way to their shores. In the heart of this forsaken land lived two men, but they were not truly living. They were vessels. Their bodies had been hijacked, their minds imprisoned by a force of pure chaos. These were the men from the tombs, the source of the region's terror, possessed by evil spirits, entities that stripped them of their identity, their families, their humanity. Day and night their tormented cries echoed through the hills, a sound not entirely human, the sound of profound suffering, souls trapped in a nightmare they could not wake from. Their existence was unimaginable agony, driven by spirits to live among the dead. Homes, cold, dark caves meant for corpses. They wore no clothes, exposed to the harsh sun, exposed to the chilling night air. Their connection to society was severed. Outcasts in the most extreme sense, feared and shunned by those who once knew them. The spirits gave them terrifying, unnatural strength. Chains and shackles were useless. The townspeople tried again and again to restrain them, hoping to protect the men and themselves, but every attempt failed. Metal links forged for the strongest criminals snapped like thread. Fetters meant to bind their feet were shattered. No one had the strength to subdue them. This power was no gift, it was part of their curse. It ensured complete isolation, a living embodiment of untamable chaos. A constant, terrifying spectacle. They roamed the wilderness, crying out, often harming themselves, striking their own bodies with sharp stones in uncontrollable frenzy. This was their life, a cycle of rage, pain, and despair. They were puppets, limbs moved by unseen hands, voices stolen, shouting obscenities and threats. A horror story made real, a warning to those who saw them from afar. The people of the Gadarenes did not see countrymen suffering. They saw monsters. They saw the physical form of the evil they feared. They had long given up hope, considered lost forever, their souls consumed by the darkness that now dwelled in the tombs. Across the water on the other side of the Sea of Galilee, a different kind of power was at work. A man named Jesus was walking the shores, teaching crowds, performing miracles. He was healing the sick. He was giving sight to the blind. He was calming storms with a single word. Whispers of his deeds traveled across the region, carried by merchants and fishermen. To the people of the Gadarenes, these stories were from another world. What could such a man of light and life have to do with a land of shadows and death? But then, one day Jesus turned to his disciples. He looked across the shimmering water toward the eastern shore. He looked toward the desolate hills of the Gadarenes, and he said, "Let us go over to the other side." This was not a casual suggestion, it was a declaration of intent, a decision to sail into the heart of territory everyone avoided. He charted a course toward the place of fear, toward the source of the region's despair. The disciples prepared the boat, apprehensive. As the small boat cut the waves, a new kind of storm began to brew. Not just a storm in the sky, though a great windstorm would rise. This was a cosmic storm. A collision was coming. Divine love and authority met entrenched evil. The sea between the shores was a threshold. On one side, order, healing, hope. On the other, chaos, torment, despair. Unseen and unknown to the two tormented men in the tombs, help was coming. They could not have prayed for it. They could not have hoped for it. They were too lost. The townspeople, locked in fear, would never have asked. But hope does not always wait. Sometimes it crosses the water, it sails through the storm, it walks into the darkest places. As the boat neared the feared shore, a final dramatic confrontation began. The fate of two souls in the grip of darkness over a region was about to be decided. Before the tombs, before the screams, before the terror, there were two men. They were not always monsters, they were sons. They might have been farmers, fishermen, craftsmen. They had names known and spoken with affection by mothers and fathers. They had lives woven into the fabric of their community. They laughed. They worked under the same sun that now scorched their naked skin. They shared meals with friends and family. Their voices joined the familiar hum of village life. They had hopes for the future, perhaps for a wife, for children, for a peaceful old age. They were ordinary men, living ordinary lives, completely unaware of the invisible war that was about to consume them. We do not know how the darkness found them. Was it a gradual creep, a slow poisoning of the soul that began with a whisper of despair? Or was it a sudden, violent invasion, a hostile takeover of their very being in a moment of weakness or tragedy? The scriptures do not tell us. But we can imagine the chilling process of their unraveling. The subtle changes at first. A shadow in their eyes, a new coldness in their demeanor. Friends and family would have noticed. They would have seen the men they knew beginning to slip away, replaced by something alien and hostile. Confusion would have turned to concern, and concern to a growing, dreadful fear. Their identities were stolen piece by piece. The spirits, the legion of darkness that infested them, began to assert control. The men's own thoughts became buried under an avalanche of malevolent voices. Their own desires were suffocated by the impulses of the entities within. They were no longer the masters of their own bodies. Every word they spoke, every action they took, was dictated by the occupying force. Imagine the horror of that internal struggle. To be a prisoner in your own mind, watching through your own eyes as your hands do terrible things, as your mouth speaks words of pure hatred. It was a slow, agonizing erasure of the self. Soon, nothing of their former selves was visible to the outside world. The men who had once been part of a community were gone, replaced by wild, unpredictable creatures. They were driven from their homes, from the warmth of human contact into the cold, desolate embrace of the tombs. The society that had once known them now rejected them, not out of cruelty but out of sheer terror. They had become unrecognizable, their humanity so deeply buried that it was thought to be extinguished forever. The men they once were became a distant, painful memory, a story told in hushed tones about what their town had lost to the darkness. The townspeople of the Gadarenes were not merely neighbors to this tragedy, they were its audience. The two possessed men became a living, breathing horror story. When the community tried to intervene, to bind them with chains and fetters for their own safety and the safety of others, their efforts were met with a shocking display of supernatural power. The snapping of iron chains was a loud declaration: human strength is useless against this kind of darkness. This repeated failure created a profound sense of helplessness throughout the region. It taught the people that they were powerless. The authorities, the strongest men in the town, the blacksmith who forged the chains, all were defeated. This wasn't just about two madmen, it was a statement about the cosmic order of things. It seemed to prove that evil was stronger than their community, stronger than their laws, stronger than their best intentions. As a result, they stopped trying. They resigned themselves to the situation, learning to live with the terror. They cordoned off that part of their world both physically and mentally, accepting it as a lost cause. The men became a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered to children and travelers. Do not go near the tombs, parents would warn. Do not take the road by the eastern shore. The men's story was used to enforce boundaries and instill a sense of fear-based wisdom. They were no longer seen as individuals who were suffering, they were seen as a phenomenon, a dangerous feature of the landscape like a cliff edge or a treacherous river. Their humanity was completely eclipsed by their terrifying function in the local mythology. They were the bogeymen, the monsters in the hills, the reason to lock your doors at night. This spectacle served the purposes of the spirits perfectly. Fear is a powerful tool of control, and through these two men the spirits held an entire region in a state of psychological bondage. The constant screams from the tombs were a broadcast of hopelessness. The sight of the men, wild and tormented, was a sermon on the power of chaos. The community's response, avoidance and fear, was exactly the desired outcome. It ensured the men remained isolated, and that the dominion of darkness over that piece of land remained unchallenged. The people of the Gadarenes were not just afraid of the two men, they were afraid of the power they represented. The journey across the Sea of Galilee had been tumultuous. A furious squall had descended upon them, a storm so violent even the experienced fishermen among the disciples were terrified. Yet, Jesus slept peacefully. When they woke him, he simply stood, rebuked the wind and the waves, and a great calm settled over the water. This miracle was a prelude, a small taste of the authority he was about to display. As the boat finally grated against the gravelly beach of the Gadarenes, the disciples were still reeling, whispering to each other, "What kind of man is this? Even the winds and the sea obey him!" They stepped out of the boat, not into a welcoming town, but onto the edge of the wilderness. The air was still and heavy, carrying a palpable sense of dread that the calming of the sea had not touched. This was the land they had all heard stories about, the land of the tombs, the land of the madmen. The disciples likely stood close to Jesus, their eyes scanning the desolate hillsides with apprehension. Every shadow seemed to move, every gust of wind sounded like a whisper. They had just witnessed Jesus command a storm, but this felt different. This was not a force of nature, it was a deeply rooted, intelligent malevolence they were stepping into. The landscape itself was hostile. Jagged rocks, thorny bushes covered the hills that rose steeply from the water's edge. The dark mouths of the burial caves dotted the cliff sides like vacant eyes, watching their every move. There was no reception party, no curious crowd gathering to see the teacher from Galilee. There was only an unnerving silence. The usual sounds of nature, the birds, the insects, seemed to be muted here. It was as if the entire region was holding its breath, waiting. Jesus stood on the shore, a figure of profound peace in a land saturated with torment, and took his first steps onto the cursed ground. This was not an accidental landing, it was a deliberate invasion. Jesus had crossed the water with a specific purpose. He had calmed a natural storm on the sea only to face a supernatural storm on the land. He was not just a visitor, he was a challenger. Every step he took up from the shoreline was a step deeper into enemy territory. The tension was escalating with each moment. The king of a heavenly kingdom had just arrived, unannounced, at the gates of a fortress of darkness. The confrontation was now inevitable. Before any of the disciples could fully process their strange and menacing surroundings, the silence was shattered. From among the tombs, a figure emerged, and then another. It was the two men. They were not walking. They were hurtling towards the small group on the shore with a terrifying speed. Their appearance was shocking, naked, covered in dirt and old blood from their self-inflicted wounds, matted hair, wild eyes. Their approach was not a greeting, it was an interception, a ferocious charge meant to terrify and repel any intruder. The disciples instinctively tensed, maybe even reaching for something to defend themselves. Their fear from the storm was instantly replaced by a more primal terror. But then, something completely unexpected. As the men drew near to Jesus, the spirits within them recognized him instantly. The ferocity of their charge faltered. They saw not just a man, a rabbi from Nazareth, but a power and authority that sent shockwaves through their very essence. The entities that had snapped iron chains and that had terrorized an entire region were suddenly confronted by a presence they could not intimidate. Before Jesus even spoke a word, the spirits knew who he was. They knew his true identity, hidden from most of the world, glaringly obvious to the supernatural realm. His very being was a threat to their existence. This was not a human reaction. The men themselves were too lost in madness to recognize anyone. This was a spiritual recognition. The darkness knew the light. The forces of chaos knew the author of order. In the presence of their ultimate judge, their posture of aggression collapsed into one of desperate negotiation. The air crackled with unseen energy. The two men, moments before they were charging with murderous intent, now fell to the ground before Jesus. It was a bizarre, jarring sight. Their bodies, still contorted by the spirits within, were now in a posture of submission, of pleading. The wildness was still in their eyes, but it was now mixed with a desperate terror. Then a voice ripped through the air, not the men's own, a grotesque, distorted sound, the spirits speaking through a human vessel. "What have you to do with us, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" they shrieked, a cry of pure dread, a full confession of his identity on this desolate shore. They did not call him rabbi. They did not call him teacher. They used his highest title, Son of the Most High God. They knew they had no right to be there in his presence, an admission of defeat before the battle began. Their cry continued frantic, "I adjure you by God, do not torment us." An incredible, ironic plea. The tormentors of the region were now begging not to be tormented. This moment revealed the true nature of the conflict. Not a healer curing two sick men, a direct confrontation between two opposing kingdoms. The kingdom of darkness, the legion of spirits, the kingdom of God, embodied in Jesus. Their recognition and fear showed his absolute authority. He hadn't spoken or performed a miracle yet. His mere presence shattered their confidence and exposed vulnerability. The battle line was drawn, the enemy was begging for mercy. Jesus, unfazed by the shrieked pleas, fixed his gaze on the men. His demeanor was not one of fear or even anger, but of calm, deliberate authority. He was not addressing the broken men on the ground. He was speaking directly to the trespassing entities that held them captive. He posed a simple, powerful question. "What is your name?" This was not a request for information out of curiosity. In the ancient world, to know something's name was to have a degree of power over it. Jesus was beginning the process of exorcism, of eviction, by demanding that the hidden enemy identify itself and come into the light.
"My name is Legion," they answered, "for we are many."
This was a terrifying revelation. Legion was a Roman military term, designating a unit of up to 6,000 soldiers. The name implied not just a multitude of spirits, but a highly organized, disciplined, and a powerful army of darkness. They were not a random collection of demons, they were an occupying force. This single word explained the men's incredible strength, their untamable nature, and the depth of their torment. They were not just possessed, they were colonized. The name Legion painted a horrifying picture of the inner world of these two men. Their minds were a battlefield, their souls a territory occupied by thousands of malevolent squatters. Every thought was a struggle, every moment a war. This admission was a boast wrapped in terror. The spirits were declaring their vast number and power, yet they were doing so while cowering before Jesus. It was a final, pathetic attempt to intimidate him, to show him the scale of the force he was confronting. But it had the opposite effect. It only served to highlight the immensity of the victory that was about to unfold. The tension on the shore reached its peak. The disciples now understood the true scale of the supernatural darkness they were facing. It was not one or two spirits, but an army. The pleas of the spirits became more frantic. They knew their time was up. They knew the authority of the man standing before them was absolute. Having been forced to name themselves, they were now fully exposed and vulnerable. Their next words would not be a challenge, but a desperate bargain, a plea for a lesser punishment, as they saw their long-held dominion over these men in this land coming to an abrupt and decisive end. In their panic, the spirits' eyes darted around, searching for any possible escape, any alternative to the abyss. Not far off on the nearby hillside, a large herd of pigs was feeding. There were about 2,000 of them, a significant agricultural enterprise for this Gentile region where pork was not considered unclean. The spirits saw the herd not as animals, but as potential vessels. A new, desperate idea formed in their collective mind. They saw a way to avoid immediate consignment to the pit, a way to perhaps remain in the region, even if it meant inhabiting a lower form of life. It was a pathetic, last-ditch effort to salvage something from their utter defeat.
"Send us to the pigs," they begged, "that we may enter them."
It was a strange and desperate bargain. They were asking permission from the one they had initially defied. They were trading the bodies of men created in the image of God for the bodies of swine. This request was a profound admission of their place in the cosmic order. They acknowledged Jesus' right to dispose of them as he saw fit, and in their terror, they would accept any destination, no matter how degrading, as long as it was not the final prison of the abyss. Jesus considered their request. He stood in silence for a moment, the fate of two men, an army of demons, and 2,000 animals resting on his next word. He could have simply commanded them into the abyss, ending their reign of terror permanently. But he had a greater lesson to teach. He was about to give a visible, unforgettable demonstration of three things: the reality and destructive nature of evil, the immense value of a human soul, and the absolute finality of his authority. The stage was set, the desperate bargain had been proposed. All of creation seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his response. The moment hung in the balance: the disciples, the pleading men, the unseen army of spirits, the distant herd of pigs. Then, Jesus spoke. He did not shout. He did not engage in a long, ritualistic incantation. He simply gave a one-word command.
Go. It was a word of pure authority, delivered with the calm certainty of a king. It was not a suggestion or a negotiation. It was a decree. The bargain was accepted. The sentence was passed. The eviction notice was served. Jesus, go.
With that single powerful syllable, the long and brutal occupation of these two men was over. The effect was instantaneous and violent. A collective, unearthly shriek might have filled the air as the spirits were ripped from their human hosts. The two men on the ground convulsed as the legion of darkness was forcibly expelled. Imagine the spiritual violence of that moment. An entire army being torn from the souls they had infested. For the first time in years, the minds of these two men were their own. The cacophony of voices was gone. The relentless torment ceased. An eerie, profound silence fell within their souls. A peace they had long forgotten was even possible. The unseen force, this dark river of malevolence, flowed out of the men and swept across the ground towards the hillside. It was a spiritual stampede, a desperate, chaotic rush toward their new, permitted destination. The herd of pigs, which had been peacefully feeding moments before, suddenly erupted into a frenzy. The animals began to squeal and panic as the unseen force washed over them. They were no longer behaving like animals. They were now under the control of the same destructive intelligence that had driven the two men to madness and self-harm. This was the visible proof of the exorcism. No one could doubt what had just happened. The herd of 2,000 pigs, now possessed by Legion, was a terrifying sight. It was chaos made flesh. The animals, driven by the spirit's self-destructive rage, did not scatter across the hills. Instead, as one, they turned and charged. There was only one direction for their frenzied stampede: down the steep bank, the cliff into the Sea of Galilee. It was, honestly, a mass suicide. A final, dramatic act of annihilation. The swineherds watched from a distance, horrified, as their entire livelihood plunged headlong into the water. The squealing of 2,000 terrified animals, the thunder of 8,000 hooves, the colossal splash as the herd plunged over the cliff's edge. The sea, calmed hours before, now churned and foamed as the possessed animals drowned. The spirits, trying to avoid the abyss, only took a detour and destroyed their hosts, ending up in the watery depths they feared. The destruction was total. In moments, the vast herd was gone. The hillside was shockingly empty. The waters grew still again, surface hiding the evidence. This violent spectacle was an unforgettable lesson. 2 restored men versus 2,000 pigs. The contrast was stark. In heaven's economy, 2 human souls reclaimed were worth infinitely more than a herd. The cost was high, but the salvation was priceless. In the wake of the chaotic stampede, a profound and unnerving stillness settled over the Gadarene shore. The thunder of hooves was gone. The tortured screams of the men had ceased. The violent churning of the sea had subsided. All that remained was the gentle lapping of waves against the shore, and the quiet breathing of the 2 men who were now free. For the first time in years, they were at peace. The inner war that had raged within them had finally ended. The ceaseless torment of 1,000 voices had finally stopped. The silence in their minds must have been the most beautiful sound they had ever known. The wild, frenzied light in their eyes was gone, replaced by a look of dawning awareness, of confusion, and then, of quiet sanity. They looked at their own hands, not as weapons of self-harm, but as parts of themselves. They looked at Jesus, not with the terrified recognition of the spirits, but with the quiet wonder of men who had been pulled from a living nightmare. Someone, perhaps one of the disciples, brought them clothes, and they dressed themselves, a simple act that signified a profound return to dignity and humanity. They were found sitting at the feet of Jesus, clothed and in their right mind. This image is one of the most powerful in the entire narrative. The men who could not be tamed, who broke chains and lived among the dead, were now sitting peacefully, willingly, in the posture of a student before his teacher. The chaos had been replaced by order. The rage had been replaced by tranquility. The nakedness and shame had been replaced by the dignity of being clothed. They were not just empty of demons, they were filled with a new sense of peace and wholeness. They had been brought back from the land of the dead into the world of the living. For these two individuals, this was the moment of their rebirth. Their identities, which had been buried under the weight of legion, were now restored. They could remember their names, their families, their pasts. But the horror that had imprisoned them was finally over. The deep wounds on their bodies would heal, but more importantly, the deeper wounds on their souls were beginning to mend under the gentle authority of the man who had command over both storms and spirits. The stillness on the shore was not an empty silence. It was the sound of two souls being made new, a testament to a power greater than destruction, a power that brings life out of death. The swineherds, having witnessed the entire horrifying spectacle, did the only thing they could think of. They fled. They ran from the eerie quiet of the shore, from the sight of the two transformed men, from the man who had caused it all. They ran to their town and into the surrounding countryside, their voices filled with panic and disbelief as they tried to explain the inexplicable. They told everyone what had happened to the pigs, the source of their terror and financial ruin, and they told them what had happened to the two men who had been possessed, the source of their long-held fear and pity. The news spread like wildfire, a mix of economic disaster and unbelievable miracle. Curiosity and fear drove the townspeople out to the shoreline. A crowd began to form, people leaving homes and fields to see for themselves. As they approached the place of the tombs, they saw a scene that stopped them in their tracks. They saw Jesus, and they saw the two men, the very men who had been the terror of their region, sitting calmly at his feet, fully clothed and perfectly sane. The evidence was undeniable. The miracle was real. The men were free. But the reaction of the crowd was not what one might expect. They were not joyful. They were not relieved. They were afraid. They were seized with a great fear. This was a different kind of fear than the one they had lived with before. They had been afraid of the familiar chaos of the demon-possessed men. Now, they were terrified by the unfamiliar power that could so easily end that chaos. They looked at the calm sea that had swallowed 2,000 pigs. They looked at the sane men who were once untamable, and they looked at Jesus, the quiet center of this incredible display of authority. This power was more frightening to them than the demons had been. And so the whole town, the entire region, came to Jesus with a single unified request. They begged him to leave their region. They saw the price of this miracle, their entire herd of pigs, and they were unwilling to welcome the one who performed it. They chose their familiar world, even with its pockets of accepted darkness, over the disruptive, costly, and terrifyingly powerful presence of the kingdom of God. They asked the light of the world to leave their shores. For us today, this story is a stark and resonant reminder. It pulls back the curtain between the seen and the unseen, insisting that there are battles being waged for the hearts and minds of humanity. The condition of the two men serves as a powerful metaphor for how people can be held captive, isolated, tormented, self-destructive, stripped of identity. But the central message is one of overwhelming hope. The story's most enduring truth is that no one is beyond saving. These two men were the ultimate lost cause. Their community had given up on them. They were living among the dead, more monster than man in the eyes of their neighbors. They were occupied by an army of darkness. By every human standard, their situation was completely and utterly hopeless. Yet Jesus crossed the water for them. He deliberately sailed into a storm and walked onto a hostile shore for the sole purpose of setting them free. This demonstrates God's relentless, pursuing love for the individual. This account shows that the value of a single human soul is immeasurable in the eyes of God. The dramatic destruction of 2,000 pigs was not a careless act, but a deliberate statement of value. It was a graphic illustration that the restoration of even one person created in God's image is worth more than any amount of worldly wealth. In a world that often measures people by their productivity, their stability, their social contribution, this is a radical declaration. It means your value is not tied to your usefulness or your wholeness. You have infinite worth, even in your most broken and tormented state. Ultimately, this is a story of hope's arrival. Hope did not wait for an invitation. It crossed the sea. It walked into the graveyard. It confronted the darkness head-on. and commanded it to leave. For anyone today who feels trapped, isolated, or overwhelmed by the legion of forces arrayed against them, this story offers a powerful promise. It declares that there is a name with more authority than legion. There is a power stronger than chaos. There is a love that will cross any sea to find you, to restore your mind, to give you back your name, and to invite you to sit at peace in its presence.